Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us, and welcome to this third in our series of webinars hosted by the Global Biodiversity Framework Task Force. This session today will provide an introduction to the STAR metric for business and policy. While we are waiting for people to join, I'd like to give an outline of the session today. So we will have time for Q&A at the end of Louise's presentation, but there will also be pauses throughout the presentation where you can raise any questions. So please do feel free to use that chat box question option below to put any questions in the chat. And we'll try to adjust these as we go along. Audience members, you are muted. So if you would prefer to ask the question directly, just raise your hand and I'll be trying to keep track of this. We can address those in the order they come through. All right, so it is my pleasure now to introduce Louise Mayer, who will be leading this introduction to STAR. Louise is a research fellow at Newcastle University in the UK, and for the last few years, her research has focused on developing the species threat abatement and restoration metric, the STAR metric, which she'll be introducing us today. This has been in partnership with the IUCN Red List. It's a phenomenal tool drawn from Red List data, and it can be used by governments, civil society, and industry to identify actions around threat abatement and habitat restoration activities that will have the most positive impact for reducing threats on threatened species on the IUCN Red List. So with that, thank you so much, Louise, for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to your presentation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will just get screen sharing set up. Okay, so hopefully now you should just see my title slide. Thank you very much for joining us today. As Alison said, it would be really nice if you want to post questions and we will pause to try and answer them as we go. I'm going to present a mixture of uses of STAR, so trying to get to the policy and business uses of STAR, but then also some of the technical details, so that for those of you who like the technical details, they are there and hopefully you can really understand how the metric works. I should also say before I start, I have been incredibly lazy when it comes to making acknowledgements throughout this presentation. There is a huge team behind STAR, so we at Newcastle collaborate most closely with our colleagues at IUCN, but there's also a really big international network involved in the origins of STAR and then the continued development of STAR. Okay, so just to kind of start with the global conservation policy context, to give you the kind of the motivation for developing STAR in the first place. A lot of the work that we do here at Newcastle involves engaging with the Convention on Biological Diversity. So the CBD was established back in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit. Its objectives are the conservation of biodiversity, sustainable use of the components of biodiversity, and the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits from using genetic resources. So it's a really wide-ranging convention. Almost every country in the world is a party to the CBD, so it's got this really incredible global overview. And basically it sets the global policy agenda for biodiversity conservation. And what happens is parties to CBD come together on a regular basis. They agree this conservation policy at the international level, and then they have to go home and work out how to implement that policy at the national level. And that's one of the kind of fundamental challenges of the CBD, is that translation from global to national. And parties to the CBD, they produce national biodiversity strategies and action plans where they lay out how they intend to meet the aims of the convention. And then they also produce reports. So they report on progress towards meeting those aims of the convention. For those of you who pay attention to policy, you might be aware that most recently the CBD agreed the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So this is a global framework to take us to 2050 in terms of policy goals. The framework is large, it's complex, it has multiple parts. It has 4 overarching goals for 2050. And these 4 goals address first of all, the conservation of biodiversity under Goal A, then the sustainable use, the benefits from using genetic resources, and finally, Goal D is all about implementation. From a species conservation perspective, so from my perspective, the really interesting part within this is the species element of Goal A. And this in itself is actually really wide-ranging when you think about the different dimensions of species conservation. So the aim is to have halted human-induced extinction of known threatened species by 2050, to have reduced the extinction rate and the extinction risk tenfold by 2050, and then also to have the abundance of native wild species increase to healthy and resilient levels. So multiple aspects of species conservation are all captured in this really ambitious goal to be achieved by 2050. That's a relatively long time frame, 2050. So to support this, the framework also includes 23 action targets. So just kind of looking at this very simplified diagram of these 23 targets, you can see just how much detail is in there, how wide-ranging and comprehensive the framework is aiming to be. So targets 1 to 8 are all about managing the major threats to biodiversity and implementing urgent action. So for example, they address protected areas, restoration of ecosystems, and then tackling the various major threats. We then have a series of targets on meeting people's needs through sustainable use. And finally, the last lot are all about tools and solutions for implementing and mainstreaming biodiversity. And these are the targets where you start to understand, for example, that we need to increase financial flows to biodiversity conservation, but also really sort of important concepts like a whole of society approach. So we need to engage all actors in biodiversity and have biodiversity mainstreamed across all sectors of society. All of these targets have a deadline of 2030, so they're very much focused on urgent actions that need to be well underway, well implemented by 2030. So you can start to see the scale of the challenge when it comes to implementing this framework. So parties to CBD have to take these global targets and work out what that means for them at the national level. And from a species perspective, when we think about what's actually needed to deliver the global framework to achieve those targets and goals for species, what we need to be able to do from a sort of practical implementation point of view is set science-based targets for species conservation across spatial scales. So we're taking goals and targets that are set at the global level and thinking, what does that mean at the national level? What does that mean at the local level? So that all of our actions that are taken in different places actually add up to reducing global species extinction risk. We then need to be able to monitor and transparently report on progress towards species conservation targets. So it's really important to recognise and celebrate progress that's been made, but also ensure that the way that we're monitoring and reporting is really robust against any greenwashing. So what we're measuring is a true reflection of progress in terms of species conservation. We want to be able to engage everyone in conservation, all actors to be engaged in identifying their potential contributions to species conservation. So it's this whole of society approach we want to be able to facilitate. And from particularly a party perspective, we want to be able to link the threat reduction targets, so targets 1 to 8, to outcomes for species extinction risk reduction, so Goal A, in order to ensure that any action we're taking towards those targets will ultimately lead towards achieving those long-term goals. And so for example, from a country perspective, you would want to be able to identify which of those targets are the most important to really focus your efforts on at a country level. And then even down to the local scale, you really do need to know what are the major threats to species in order to start planning action. So it was really to meet these range of needs when you're thinking about translating global species goals and targets down to actual action at the local and national level that STAR emerged, basically. So STAR was developed through a collaboration between IUCN, Newcastle, and a whole range of partners. So we actually had partners from across all 5 inhabited continents. It's been a really big effort to develop it in the first place, and there's a huge amount of work all over the world still going on in its continued development. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time introducing what STAR does, the kind of principles of STAR, and then also introducing how STAR is calculated and the data that it relies on. This is where things will get a little bit more technical, so please do post any questions where you want clarification. Okay, so the whole point of STAR, the Species Threat Abatement and Restoration Metric, is to be able to quantify the potential contribution to species extinction risk reduction that can be made through action taken with any given area. So you might be talking about a particular site, you might be talking about a landscape, the corporate footprint of a business, a country, all the way up to the global level. And STAR considers 2 types of action. So we consider threat abatement in existing natural habitat, so reducing threats in species natural habitat. And we also consider restoring natural habitat that's been lost. The major assumption we make with STAR is that if you were to completely alleviate threats to species, then it would halt their population or distribution decline such that the species would be considered as least concern on the red list. So we're very much working within the framework of the IUCN red list. So for anyone that's not deeply familiar with the IUCN red list, it's a system for categorizing species extinction risk based on quantified criteria. Species that are assessed can be least concern, which means generally they're doing okay, they're not at risk of extinction. They can be near threatened, and that means that were any of the threats to continue or to get worse, they would be likely to move into the threatened with extinction categories. And those threatened categories are then vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered. And beyond that, you're looking at species that are extinct in the wild or completely extinct. So what we're focusing on with STAR are those 3 threatened categories and near threatened species as well. And we're assuming that if we could just alleviate all threats to those species, they would eventually become least concern and they'd be doing okay. So I'm actually going to start with a bit of an explanation of what STAR can tell you, and then go into how STAR is calculated so that you can see how we get to that use of STAR. So if you were to run your STAR analysis for your site of interest, then you would get a threat abatement score and you would get a separate restoration score for that area. The bigger your threat abatement or restoration score, the greater the potential for that area to contribute to the reduction of species extinction risk, either through abating threats or through restoring natural habitat. So in this hypothetical figure here, the score for threat abatement is much, much larger than for restoration. And basically that's saying that your greatest potential at this site to reduce species extinction risk would be through tackling threats to species in their natural habitat. STAR scores can then be broken down into scores per threat, which gives you the relative contribution of each of those threats to species extinction risk at that site. Therefore, you can identify what are the major threats to species at your site of interest. So again, it's just hypothetical, but in this scenario, we have 3 threats operating at the site. The biggest threat comes from invasive species, then followed by agriculture and pollution. So for example, you might then start thinking about what that means in terms of action that you want to take and the targets you want to set. You can quantify these targets in terms of their expected contribution to reducing species extinction risk. So at this site, invasive species accounts for 50% of the threat abatement score. And that means, therefore, that if you were to eradicate invasive species at the site, you would expect to see a 50% reduction in species extinction risk at that site. So this is what gives you that quantitative link between the threat abatement action that you're intending to implement and your expected impact in reducing species extinction risk. Okay, so that's the principle. That's what we are expecting STAR to be able to tell us, basically. In terms of how we get there, how STAR is actually calculated. STAR uses data drawn from the IUCN Red List, the global Red List. So we need information on species extinction risk, and we focus on near threatened and then the 3 threatened categories of species. We need information on the threats that species face, and this is systematically documented as part of Red List assessments for each species. So assessors classify the threats to species according to a standard threats classification scheme. They document the scope and the severity of those threats, and they document the timing of those threats, whether they're past, ongoing, or predicted to occur in the future. STAR is a spatial metric, and to get there, to get spatial data, we use current and restorable area of habitat. So current area of habitat is the distribution of habitat that's suitable for the species within its range. Restorable area of habitat is the distribution of natural habitat that would have been suitable for the species but has been lost. So it's the potential for natural habitat restoration within the species range. So to calculate both of these, we need species distribution polygons, habitat associations, and elevation limitations, all of which come from the IUCN Red List. That's part of the assessment process. And then we also need land cover maps, and you need land cover maps from multiple time periods in order to get the restorable AOH calculation. Okay, so I have one slide with equations for those of you who like equations, but I do think it's helpful just to break down how those components fit together. I'm not going to spend lots of time on this though. So for any given site, the threat abatement score is calculated by taking the extent of current AOH for the species at the site, expressed as a percentage of the total global current AOH. So this is the part that makes STAR scalable. It's telling you how much your site contributes in terms of the percentage of that species' global area of habitat. We multiply this by a Red List category weighting. So we use the same scale as the Red List index, a linear scale, where we go from 1 for near threatened through to 4 for critically endangered. And then the final piece is multiplying by the relative contribution of each threat to the species extinction risk. And this information is derived from the scope and severity scores for each threat. So that's how those kind of 3 parts come together to give you a threat abatement score. For each site, you get a complementary restoration score. And this has some similarities, but there are a couple of key differences. First of all, we use the extent restorable AOH for the species at the site because we are considering the potential for restoration. The species weighting and the relative contribution of threats is exactly the same. It's worth noting that we include the relative contribution of threats within the restoration score because we assume that as you are restoring habitat, you will have to mitigate those threats that exist within the area anyway for restoration to be successful. And then the second difference is the restoration score has a multiplier that reduces the restoration score to reflect the lower and slower return on restored habitat in terms of benefits to species conservation. So this value is taken from a global meta-analysis, and it's basically just to reflect the length of time that restoration takes, and also the fact that in some cases you may not get to sort of pristine natural habitat as your kind of end result. So that's the calculation. These are the global results for STAR calculated for terrestrial, amphibians, birds, and mammals. So we have a total threat abatement score, and this has been divided up into the relative contribution to the score from the different threats. And we also have a total habitat restoration score. So the first thing to note is that the habitat restoration score is telling us that from these data, you could contribute about a 40% reduction in species extinction risk by restoring natural habitat globally. So there is really good potential for habitat restoration to contribute to species extinction risk reduction, but the threat abatement score is considerably larger. That's really kind of where the biggest immediate potential lies. When we split up the threat abatement score by the relative contribution of different threats, we can start to see what are the major threats to these species groups at the global level. So the biggest threat comes from agriculture, from annual and perennial non-timber crops. Then we've got logging and wood harvesting, then invasive species. Then another dimension of agriculture, we've got livestock, urban expansion, hunting, climate change, pollution, etc. What's really nice about this is that the major threats identified by STAR really closely reflect the big 5 drivers identified through the IPBES report. So we've got agriculture, we've got land use change driven by logging, driven by agriculture, urban expansion, we've got invasive species. So it's a really good reflection of what we know about the major impacts on biodiversity. What we can also do at the global level is map STAR scores. So this is a map of the total threat abatement score. The darker the red, the higher the score. The higher the score, the more species at greater risk of extinction you have in that area. Therefore, the greater the potential for action taken within those areas to contribute towards reducing global species extinction risk. So the map's really showing what we already know are hotspots of threatened species. So we've got some really strong colours in Central and South America, Madagascar's popping out, Eastern Asia, all these areas where we know we've got lots of threatened species. And what these kind of maps can start to help us think about is in terms of international flows of finance for supporting biodiversity, where would they be where would they be best directed if we want to have the biggest impact? We can start to identify where we might want to invest in order to have the biggest impact in reducing species extinction risk. Similarly, we can produce a map for the total STAR restoration score. So in this figure, the darker the blue, the higher the score, and this means that you have more species that are more threatened with extinction occurring in areas where there has been a relatively large amount of natural habitat loss. Therefore, there's a high potential for habitat restoration to contribute towards reducing species extinction risk. So this is slightly different, obviously, than the threat abate component in that it is also accounting for habitat loss across the globe. So the global figures are quite nice to get that kind of high-level overview, but really we're imagining that STAR is going to be most useful at a site or a landscape level. So we have calculated STAR at a much finer resolution for a landscape in Indonesia, where there's a variety of land uses. And what we've got here on the map is the threat abatement score in green. So this is a naturally forested landscape. So the green indicates where that natural forest remains, and the darker the green, the greater the potential for threat abatement within that natural forest to contribute to species extinction risk reduction. The purple is showing the restoration score. So this is where that natural forest has been lost, and in this landscape it's largely due to conversion to agriculture. And where you have a darker purple, you've got greater potential for habitat restoration activities to reduce species extinction risk. What's nice about getting down to the landscape level is that we can demonstrate how STAR is scalable. So this particular landscape is within Sumatra, and the total threat abatement score for this landscape is 0.2% of the total threat abatement score of Sumatra, which doesn't sound like very much, but actually the land area is less than 0.2% of the land area of Sumatra. So it actually is having a potentially outsized contribution. If you were to alleviate all the threats within this landscape, you'd be reducing the extinction risk across Sumatra by 0.2%. It's 0.04% of the total score for Indonesia, and then 0.003% of the global threat abatement score. So this is how you get that scaling of STAR across scales. You can start to put the potential contributions within your particular landscape into context at a regional, a national, or a global level. And of course, the other thing that STAR tells us is the relative contribution of different threats. So in this landscape, the biggest threat comes from agriculture, and specifically from annual and perennial non-timber crops. Following this, we've got threats from logging and wood harvesting. And in this particular landscape, the next biggest threat is from hunting and collecting terrestrial animals. So this information helps you to start thinking about what would be the actions that we would want to plan in this landscape to reduce threats to species. What would be the most important actions that we could undertake? Okay, so the key properties of STAR that I hope have started to emerge from the explanation of how STAR is calculated and what STAR can tell you. First of all, it allows you to identify the major threats to species at a particular site. It's been designed so that it's scalable, so you can calculate it from a small site all the way up to the global level. It's also been designed to be additive. So if, for example, you're a business working across multiple different sites, you can add up your STAR scores across all those sites into a total contribution that you're making. It's been designed to respond over policy relevant time periods. So what we mean by this is because we've got a focus on threat reduction, we can measure the changes in threat intensity over much shorter time periods than, for example, if we were waiting for a population change in a really long-lived species. So we expect to be able to measure progress on shorter timescales. And it makes use of the best available data. So the IUCN Red List is really well trusted within global policy, and it's already really widely used. STAR allows you to calculate scores in a lot of different ways. You can break down and add up scores in a lot of different ways. You can get a score per species, per site, for a particular threat, for an entire taxonomic group, all the way up to globally. It gives you a lot of different dimensions. And all of this allows contributions from state and non-state actors towards the GBF to be assessed. It's a framework that should work for any actor. There are also some really important considerations when it comes to understanding how STAR can be used, what the limitations are, and what the kind of needs are. So the data that I've just presented are global assessments that we call estimated scores. So they're derived from global level data, and they provide you with a preliminary evaluation. So I'll explain exactly what that means in a second. The second kind of part, though, that's important to consider about these global scores is that the restoration component will very much depend on how you calculate the area of restorable habitat. I mean, it seems obvious, but it's a really kind of important consideration to bear in mind when you're interpreting the restoration scores. These estimated data have to make a few assumptions simply because they come from global data where we don't have refined information. So one of the major assumptions that estimated STAR makes is that species populations are uniformly distributed across their area of habitat. We know that's not true, but we simply don't have that level of detailed information across all species. A second major assumption is that we have to assume that threat impacts are uniform across the species area of habitat as well. And again, this is simply due to a lack of refined resolution data on threat impacts, but that's something that we're working quite hard on understanding whether we can get to a slightly more nuanced data set in terms of the spatial distribution of threat impacts. And all of this means that to actually implement STAR at a site level, then calibration is needed. So calibration of estimated scores means using local data. So that might be species observation data, remote sensing data, information from local specialists, in order to confirm that the species we expect to be present really are present at the site, and also that the threats that we expect to be present are present and how intense, how severe their impacts are. By using that local data on species and threats, you then get to a calibrated STAR score that's much more accurately representative of the local state. So that's the kind of next step. Once you've got your estimated STAR scores and you started to think about where you're interested in, you move on to the calibration process. Okay, so I've got a brief pause here, and Ali can jump in if there are any questions at this stage, because I realise that's quite a lot of information to throw at everyone.
Thanks, Louise. Yeah, no, brilliant. I think it's super well paced. We do have some questions from Jennifer in the Q&A. I think so. The first one, she was asking, would STAR incorporate the green status of species? Is that possible? So will it be able to quantify the potential contribution to the recovery of a species through specific actions, in addition to the potential contribution for decreasing extinction risk?
I think that's a really good and challenging question. We have been very much working on the dimension of getting from threatened with extinction to least concern. And least concern doesn't mean that the species is fully recovered in the way that green status defines it. So it's almost like moving from the red to the neutral, and then can we apply the same principles to get from the neutral to the green? And I think that's a really good question, and something that has been on our minds and we do not have an answer to, but I like to think that the principles would certainly, we could certainly develop the principles and explore that, because I think it would be a really, really nice thing to be able to do.
Thanks, Louise. A really positive next step.
Yeah.
A big one. She's also asking if STAR could provide results for species affected by disease, and she's giving the example of amphibians and the chytrid fungus.
Yeah. So chytrid is often relatively well documented in species red list assessments. So within the threat classification system, there is a specific threat from disease, and that's where chytrid goes. The challenge obviously is chytrid is spatially distributed, but not in a way that you can measure using any sort of remote sensing data or anything. You need that local information to actually establish whether your particular population of the species is being affected by chytrid, or whether chytrid's made it into the landscape generally. So it is in there, and we can certainly see it coming out really quite strongly. It's particularly, obviously, for amphibians in the South American landscape and different areas. The challenge is getting from that estimated STAR score, where it's very clearly coming out, to the calibrated STAR score in terms of understanding whether it's present at a particular site.
Thanks, Louise. We have two more questions also. Are you happy to take them, or should we?
Yeah, let's go for it. Let's go for it.
Okay. So Jennifer's also asking if you could elaborate on the spatial data needed for STAR. So species distribution and land use were mentioned. Are ecosystem or habitat types needed?
So in terms of the spatial data, the purpose of using area of habitat rather than species entire distribution is to try to get to something a bit more refined than species distribution polygons, which are generally quite generous in identifying the distribution of species. The way that you get to area of habitat, there have been a range of approaches implemented so far in the literature, and it's trying to establish, first of all, what's the most transparent process, so that we can have a really transparent data pipeline, but also what's the most helpful in terms of producing a product that people understand how it's got there and understand how it can be used and how it relates to their local data. So there's no reason that you cannot, or you could not, use something like ecosystem information, or you could use national habitat maps, which might differ from global land cover data sets. But at the moment, what we're focusing on is a pipeline that works globally. So we're focusing on matching the species habitat associations that are documented in the red list to land cover categories based on global land cover maps, so that we've got that global applicability. But what I will get onto later are some national examples, where in one of them we have used national land cover maps, which are actually far more refined than anything you would get at the global level. So you get out much more refined maps at the end of it.
Thanks, Louise. So more to come on that later for you, Jennifer.
Yeah.
Finally, we have one question from Julia, who is asking, she understands the STAR metric is focusing on threats to certain land-based animal taxa, reptiles, birds, etc. Can you explain why the limitation focus exists and what the potential is to expand the method to other animal groups, plants and marine species, and are there plans to do so?
There are, and it is in a slide later. I promise I'm going to address that. But I think it's worth explaining that there's kind of two parts to the initial focus. First of all, mapping species on land is easier than mapping species in the ocean, simply because of data availability. So it's a more straightforward place to start. But also with STAR, what we really try and emphasize is that we want to minimize any kind of introduction of bias in terms of the way that different taxonomic groups, that got the extent to which different taxonomic groups have been assessed. So we started with amphibians, birds and mammals because they had all been comprehensively assessed on the red list at the time we started this project. And what we're working on now is going through the species groups across realms, so marine and freshwater and terrestrial, that have been comprehensively assessed and working on including them into the STAR metric. So I will properly address that. But it's a really good point. Taxonomic limitations are always incredibly frustrating. Our main concern is that we want to make sure that whatever data does go in is unlikely to be biased. So, yep.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Louise. I think that answers everything that we've currently got in the chat. Oh no, sorry, I've scrolled down. We have a few more from Karim, who's asking how granular is STAR in the European context, and can companies easily differ where to focus their activities regarding threat abatement restoration? Maybe that leads into your next set of slides.
I will touch on that, I promise.
We'll get to you, Karim.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool.
Take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so hopefully answering all of these questions at the same time. I want to try and just give a bit more context on how we imagine STAR being used within policy and business decision making. So as I explained, these global data are what we consider estimated STAR. So they give you that estimate of the potential of an area to contribute towards global species extinction risk reduction. And the data that underlie that are the expected presence of species and threats in the area. What we imagine those uses to be at that initial stage, so my yellow highlighted box at the bottom, you might, for example, use estimated STAR if you were going to carry out some initial screening across a portfolio of sites. Those initial estimated STAR scores would tell you where you would expect sites to have the most species at the greatest risk of extinction, and therefore the greatest potential to contribute to species extinction risk reduction. So if you were choosing between tens or hundreds of sites where you might want to start to focus, you could use estimated STAR for that screening. If you're, for example, just working on one site, estimated STAR gives you that initial data on species and threats from which you can then work to carry out your calibration. So the next step is calculating calibrated STAR. So during calibration, you use local data to verify the potential contribution of that area. And you do this by confirming the presence of species and the present intensity of threats in that area. And these data, your locally verified data, allow you to more confidently identify the most significant threats to species in that area and allow you to start planning action. So they form the basis of your action plan for that site. What you would then do with that is set some target STAR scores. So you want to set threat reduction targets, and these threat reduction targets can be related to the expected reduction in extinction risk. At this point, you're going to need a measure of the baseline threat intensity in order to be able to make quantified threat reduction targets. So for example, you might be measuring the frequency of snares encountered during a transect walk, and you could aim to reduce that frequency, for example, by half. The purpose of this part of having a target STAR is that it allows you to transparently set targets in a way where your contribution towards wider targets can be quantified. So it might be the contribution of one site relative to the whole portfolio of sites you're working at if you're a business, or it might be your contribution to regional or national or even global targets. And if, for example, you're a country, you might report those targets in your national biodiversity strategies and action plan document. So you're transparently saying this is what we're aiming to do. Or if you're a business, they might form part of your voluntary biodiversity disclosures. So you're setting yourself some biodiversity targets. And then the final part, once you have implemented your action, or while you're implementing your action, you monitor the change in threat intensity and hence progress towards your threat reduction targets. So it's really important that you identify a suitable way of measuring change in threat intensity that allows transparent reporting. Your Realise star gives you that ability to quantifiably report on the progress that you're making towards your targets. So if you're a country, this might go into your national report. And again, if you're a business, that would be your next biodiversity disclosure. You'd be able to report on progress towards the targets that you had previously transparently set. So this is the kind of the idea, the pipeline of STAR and the ways in which it can be used at each stage. So if we go back to this hypothetical example, STAR is allowing countries to identify the major threats and therefore which of the action targets are the most important. So in this context, you can see that target 6 would be the most important, but also target 10 and 7, addressing agriculture and pollution. This is allowing you to set and report on science-based targets. And as an example of that, in this hypothetical figure, invasive species contribute 50% of the total STAR score, agriculture contributes 30%, and pollution contributes 20%. You might therefore decide that the most feasible action, and also the action that would result in the greatest impact, is to eradicate invasive species. So your target is to achieve 50% of that threat abatement score. Your target is to eradicate invasive species, and consequently, you expect achievement of that target to result in a reduction of species extinction risk at the site of 50%. So that's how they all kind of link together. That's how the threat intensity links to species extinction risk. You would want to monitor your invasive eradication efforts and then be able to report back on this. So within the framework, within the GBF framework, you would be reporting on the success of your eradication, which would be as a contribution towards target 6, which is the invasive species target. But that in itself would be making a contribution towards reducing species extinction risk under Goal A. So here's your linkage between the action targets and the outcomes for species under Goal A. So I mentioned that we envisage STAR as a way for countries to identify the most important targets for them. And there's been a really nice project which has now moved on to phase 2 called Biodiv 2030. And the aim of this was to work with a series of countries, mostly based in Africa, to identify which sectors, which industry sectors were the most important ones to engage for mainstreaming biodiversity. So which sectors were having the biggest impact in biodiversity and had the greatest potential to reduce that impact. So it's a really, really nice stakeholder engagement project. They used a range of tools, including STAR, and STAR was allowing them to identify what were the major threats to species at the country level, and then associate those threats with the industry driving those threats. So it's a really nice example of how STAR can be used at that national, fairly high kind of level. Okay, so thinking about the limitations and addressing this taxonomic issue. What we're working on just now is producing a scientific manuscript and parallel user guidance for calibrated and realised STAR. So for moving on from those global estimates to data that's locally specific and that you can then use to set targets and measure progress. And we're working on expanding the taxonomic and the spatial coverage of STAR. So marine STAR has actually been developed, the threat abatement component has been developed and published. Freshwater is very much underway. We're making really good progress with that, and that should be ready for publication soon. We're working on adding reptiles, and we're exploring the inclusion of plants. And I'm being a little bit more tentative there because plants are a whole different ballgame. And this is largely due to, well, two things: the nature of the spatial data, but also simply the ecology of plants. One of the challenges we face with plants is they're often recorded as point occurrences. And it's very difficult to know, unless you conducted a really thorough survey, whether between 2 points the species is also present, or the species is entirely absent and really is, point endemic. So this is a big challenge, working out how we can deal with that level of uncertainty in the data, which is partly a reflection of the kind of under-recording and the much smaller effort that goes into observing plants compared to observing animals. But it is a priority that we're working pretty hard on at the moment to try and solve. So just to give you a look at what the marine layer looks like, this was some work published by Turner et al. It's a really nice figure in that it reflects a lot of what we kind of know about the distribution of threatened species. And it includes, for example, sharks and rays, the ray-finned bony fishes, reef-building corals, marine birds and mammals, the taxonomic groups that use the marine environment and have been comprehensively assessed in the red list are included. In terms of how you actually get your hands on these data, so at the moment, the resolution of STAR is 5 kilometre. And STAR is variable in the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool, or IBAT. It's only available for terrestrial amphibians, birds and mammals, and it's only threat level information that's available. So we do not yet have species level data included, but we're working on tackling all of this. So STAR will be downscaled to 1 kilometre resolution to give you a much finer resolution. Marine and freshwater will be included. Reptiles will be added, and then species level data will be available as well, so that eventually what you'll get for any particular site is the full suite of species expected to be at that site and the threats impacting them. Okay, so I hope I've answered the questions that came through in terms of the resolution of STAR, taxonomic coverage, and started to address the availability as well. The last thing that I'd like to present is some work that we did applying STAR to national red lists. So far everything has focused very much on the global IUCN red list data. But we recognised that national red lists are really important because they provide more localised context. So species are often nationally threatened, but globally least concern. Particularly if you think of the UK, it's a very good example of that. National red lists allow countries to focus on the taxa that are of national importance. The Nordics, for example, work really hard on red listing their fungi and lichens and mosses because they're very much forest-associated species in their countries. And national red lists often have a broader taxonomic scope than the global red list, so there's a huge number of benefits. Countries often appreciate the ownership that comes with national red lists as well, and generally often prefer to use them where they can. So we worked with partners across 3 different countries to apply STAR to national red lists for plants. So we worked with colleagues in South Africa. They have assessed all of their endemic plants, and there's almost 2,000 species within the threatened categories. We worked with Brazil. Now, they are so biodiverse that they have made a massive effort. They've got to the point where they've assessed roughly 22% of their endemic plants, which amounts to more than 2,500 species within the threatened and near-threatened categories. And then in a very different context, we work with partners in Norway. So they have assessed all of their plants, which are non-endemic, and that amounts to 300 species across the near-threatened and threatened categories. So I'm going to present relatively briefly the main figures for each of these countries. And for me, one of the most interesting things is the relationship between the data going in and what we can actually get out of STAR at the end. So for Brazil, we've got the information on the relative contribution of the different threats. Natural system modification comes out on top, but this is partly because it's a catch-all for land use change. So it would be helpful to get to the stage where that information is more refined and we start to understand those drivers of land use change. In terms of the map, what you'll notice is there are lots of lines across the map. And this is a reflection of the challenges in terms of collecting species observation data in a country like Brazil. Most of that collection is done along roadways because it's the only sort of feasible way to access the habitats. And as a result, what we're getting here are these maps that really kind of reflect urban clusters and the roads going between them. Norway, on the other hand, don't map species distribution polygons or observation points. They simply say whether a species is present or absent within each county. So this gives us a map of scores per county. What's also interesting with Norway is that climate change comes out as the major threat to plant species. So we've got this high latitude country and we're seeing very different patterns here, with climate change really being the major threat. And finally, South Africa. So South Africa is a really, really nice example because their data is so detailed and comprehensive. So we've got the map, or the figure of the relative contribution of different threats. And for plants in South Africa, the biggest threat comes from invasive species. And then we've got the map of the total threat abatement scores. And this is really refined within South Africa because we used their national land cover map, which is much more appropriate for that national context. So that's what I was talking about in terms of the different habitat maps that you can use depending on the scale of your analysis. What we were also able to do for South Africa was map the scores for the threat from invasive species specifically. And what's really nice here is that this map quite accurately reflects the distribution of the severity of invasive species impact. So they are a major, major problem down in the Cape region. That's where they're having the biggest negative impact. And that's really what we're seeing here on this map for this particular threat. And then finally, what we were able to do for South Africa that we weren't able to do for the other countries was map the restoration scores. And again, this was thanks to using the national land cover map. So we worked with our partners to identify specific land cover categories where habitat restoration would actually be a realistic prospect. And we used that information to map the restoration score. And I think this is probably kind of our best restoration output because it's much more grounded in feasibility in terms of habitat restoration potential. So what did we learn from this? First of all, STAR is pretty flexible depending on data availability. We can cope with different threat classification systems. We can cope with varying species mapping approaches, but it's very much a case of the data going in determines the data coming out the other end. We can apply the threat abatement component as a discrete analysis, which is what we did for Norway and Brazil. But what's a really important caveat to bear in mind is that results can only be placed in the global context if the species included are endemic. And this is because for endemic species, their national extinction risk is the same as their global extinction risk. So our Brazil results and our South Africa results can be placed within the global context because they were focused entirely on endemics. But Norway was very much a national case study because their non-endemic species will have a different national red list status compared to the global red list status. And finally, we definitely have this strong preference for including only comprehensively assessed taxonomic groups because we don't want to introduce bias where groups have not been comprehensively assessed and there may be geographic bias in terms of which have been assessed, or there may be a preference for red listing the species we expect to be most threatened, for example. But it's also important to be pragmatic. So, for example, in the case of Brazil, our colleagues there felt that the sample that they did have was representative of the plant biodiversity of Brazil and therefore was suitable for use. So that was really nice to be able to include that data. Okay, and this is my last slide. So just to kind of let you know where we're at in terms of star development, we're working really hard to increase the accessibility of the usefulness of the metric in response to user needs. We're engaging with policymakers and also businesses to work out, to actually work on examples of applying STAR in decision-making contexts and understand what needs to be done in terms of technical development, conceptual development of STAR. So we're really, really open to feedback on the use of STAR, particularly where anyone's interested in actually using STAR in decision-making. It's very much a dialogue, and STAR is very much always under development. So it's really, really nice to hear input and feedback from other people. And as I said at the beginning, I have done a very poor job of acknowledging contributions, but there have been many, many contributions from lots of different organisations, and I owe a big thanks to all of the co-authors. So thank you very much, and it'd be great. I think we've got 5 minutes for a few more questions. Stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Louise. That was brilliant. We do have just under 5 minutes left now. We've got a couple of questions in the chat and in the Q&A. Sean has asked about threat reduction and that realized STAR component. So if you're not able to fully abate a threat, so if you can't reduce invasive species fully, but only by a fraction, what can you, how does the metric calculate that?
So it's we assume a linear relationship, and we would hope that in the future we could test that assumption. But basically, so for example, say you were measuring invasive species in terms of a number of nests predated, then rather than saying we fully eradicated, there's no nest predated, you could say we have managed to control invasive species such that nest predation has been reduced by half. You would be able to report back on that in terms of you have achieved half of that score for the threat from invasive species. So it's to say it would translate across all threats and all kind of degrees of abatement. You're allowed to, or you can report on progress towards complete abatement. It doesn't have to be complete abatement.
Okay, thanks so much, Louise. Then perhaps maybe a slightly trickier one from Mark. How are migratory species assessed if they're inhabiting multiple areas, each with different threats?
This is, yeah, we've had a lot, a lot of discussion around this. And it's a really challenging one conceptually. I think once we can agree on what needs to be done conceptually, then implementation will be straightforward. But it's that question of, first of all, do we have the data to properly tackle this? And if we do, how should we weight breeding versus non-breeding habitat, or even more nuanced parts of a species life cycle? And that's really, really challenging. But it is something that's very much on our mind. What's interesting is that when people ask about this, it's almost always ecologists who ask. I mean, obviously you would expect that, but for example, a business user wouldn't have even thought of it. So it's a conceptual ecological question we're really interested in tackling, but it is really tricky.
Thanks, Louise. We're right up on our hour. Are you happy to stay on the line a little bit more to answer a few questions, or yeah? Thank you so much for the questions that are coming through. I appreciate if some of you have to leave now, but I think it'd be really nice to get through as many as we can while we're on the same space. So we have a question about the global prioritization screening. How can this be done practically with STAR? So Joko has tested the IBAT interface a little bit, but it seems that you need to generate individual reports for locations. Is there a practical way to overlay production locations with the global maps to get comparative scores without generating the longer and detailed reports for each location and mining through these? That's in the chat if you wanted to have.
Yeah, sorry, no, I understood that, and I'm going to actually write that down as a note, because that's a really, no, the functionality doesn't exist right now, but it's really helpful to know that people would like that functionality. So it's a case of us understanding that as a user demand and basically adding it to the list of technical updates we want to make. So it's helpful that that we know that people want that.
We'll make a note of that as well. You don't need to find that one. Then Julia is asking if there are any examples of companies using STAR in the context of their sustainability management.
So we have just early in the year agreed a really nice collaboration between IUCN, Stora Enso, and us. So Stora Enso are a Swedish forestry company, and basically their ambition is to kind of be the leaders in terms of sustainable forestry. So they want to expand their definition of sustainability to include biodiversity, and we're working with them to understand how they can use STAR to do that. So it's a really exciting project. I'm looking forward to seeing what we can do.
Yeah, just getting more people involved, just getting the word out there, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me see. Julia's also asking if the marine STAR is integrated in IBAT. I think you covered that in that it's to come.
Yes.
And then we have a question from Oriel. After a company has identified a site where they want to reduce threat risk, what are the data they need to collect on the ground to calibrate the STAR score on that site?
Yeah. So it will partly depend on the context of your site, where you might want to draw the data from. But basically what you want to know is, are the species that you expect to be present really there? And are the threats really there, and how intense are they? So in terms of species presence, using, for example, a resource such as GBIF is a really good start, but you might also need local concentration. Depending on the landscape, it might not have been very well recorded, but local specialists will be able to actually tell you whether or not the species is expected to be present, or there's evidence that species is present in the landscape. And then in terms of threats, there's lots of different ways to tackle that. Local specialists tend to be the best first port of call. And for example, we've got some work that we are slowly getting towards publication that basically used specialist knowledge to identify which threats were operating in the landscape. But the specialists themselves then said, okay, we know land cover change is a massive impact, but we can't quite separate out the effects of urban expansion, agricultural expansion. And then we implemented a remote sensing analysis to tackle that particular question. So there's lots of different ways that data can be combined, and it'll be very much context dependent, which is the most suitable source.
Thanks, Louise. And there's a lot of guidance as well on this already that we can link to about how businesses can use and implement STAR. So perhaps following this, we'll link to those documents. We have one challenging, I think, question. Sorry if I pronounce your name, if I completely butcher it, but from Lashnanthi, I'm so sorry, is asking, is scoring species based on the biomass pyramid an effective way to consider food chains to STAR scoring in a way to prevent unbalanced restoration that disrupts the ecosystem?
That's a really cool idea. Yeah, so there's a few ideas emerged like this, and I would love to see groups or experts in this pick these ideas up. So I hadn't heard anyone suggest biomass before, but I think that would be incredibly interesting. The other thing that has been suggested is phylogenetic uniqueness would be another way to weight species alternatively to the way that we've chosen to do it. So we very much wanted to stick to something comparable to the Red List Index, because it fits in well with what policymakers understand, with the way the data is normally used, all that kind of thing. But I think these explorations of other ways that we could weight species and other ways we could recognise those like dimensions of species conservation would be really cool. That'd be good.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for those questions. I think looking through, we've answered. I'm just going to check the chat because we had some in there as well. We've gone about 5 minutes over, so thank you so much for those of you that stuck around, and thank you, Louise. I don't see any hands up, so I think we'll call it there. I can see some people congratulating in the chat. Thank you so much again for joining us, and thank you, Louise. That's been a really brilliant, fascinating overview. So I'm sure we'll get a lot of congratulations and getting the news out there about what STAR can do. So thank you again. Thank you to our audience, and have a lovely rest of the day.
Thank you.
Bye.